now. Yeah, and the slides look great, so thanks. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Thanks. So I'm going to start by just giving us a little bit of a tour of the brain, sort of, and I want to talk a little bit about the neurobiology of the brain, and that just gives us kind of a foundational understanding of what might be happening as we're learning and as we're responding to stress. So I like to use this analogy of computers. So if we think about our brain like a computer, we know that every brain has the same hardware. And so tonight I'm going to just kind of break down the sort of physiology of the brain into 3 different sections. And I'm going to start with the brainstem and the cerebellum. And basically, I typically talk about the brain from the back to the front or from the bottom to the top. And so the brainstem and the cerebellum, that's located at the base of your skull, the cerebellum, and then the brainstem extending down into the spinal cord. This part of our brain is responsible for basic bodily functions, things that have to happen automatically in order to keep us alive. So we don't want to have to remind ourselves to breathe or to think consciously about making our heart beat. Those things, we need those things to happen automatically in order to stay alive. And so this part of our brain, it doesn't think. This part of our brain only reacts, and super important for these basic bodily functions. The next level of the brain is colored in this image in the blue, and it's often referred to as the midbrain. Also, we might talk about it as the emotional brain or the reactive brain. This part of our brain houses the limbic system, and 2 really important structures in the limbic system are the amygdala and the hippocampus. So the hippocampus is the part of our brain that accesses all of our memories. And when I think about the hippocampus, I used to get really confused between the hippocampus and the hypothalamus, and those 2 like terms, vocabulary words would really, I'd get mixed up. So I made this picture in my mind to help me remember what the purpose of the hippocampus is, and this is a picture. So I picture a hippo kind of going to school, and kind of like a cartoon hippo with a backpack on. And that backpack is filled with all of the prior knowledge, background experiences, all the memories of the student, of the hippo, right? And it's that backpack, those memories, that we hook new learning onto. So the hippocampus is a super important part of the brain. The amygdala also is very important. These are almond-shaped structures, one on each side of our brain. The amygdala works as a sort of switching station in our brain. And so if you think about like a train on a track, and it comes to a split in the track, and there's like a switch that tells the train which direction to go, that's basically one of the major functions of the amygdala. So when the amygdala receives sensory stimuli, the amygdala determines, is this a stimuli, is this information that I need to send to the prefrontal cortex so the brain can think about it, do some rational problem solving, or is this a stimulus, is this a input that I need to send to the fight, flight, or freeze response? So am I in danger? And if so, I need to be ready to fight, flight, or freeze. And so the amygdala is the determining structure there. And so both of these are going to be really important for us as we think about stress and the threat that stress that we perceive when we feel stressed, and then how our brains respond to that. So the amygdala is super important element of tonight's conversation. And then the last part of the brain I want to talk about is the cerebral cortex. And tonight we're going to specifically talk about the prefrontal cortex. In our picture, that's colored yellow. And the prefrontal cortex is here in the front of the brain. This part of the brain is responsible for our executive functioning, and we're going to talk more in depth about executive functioning, but that's basically things like organizing, setting goals and making plans, all of the things we need to make a schedule. So those are pieces of executive functioning. This part of our brain is also responsible for rational thinking, for self-regulation, for problem solving. So we want to have a lot of energy in the prefrontal cortex. That's where our rational thinking happens, and that's where we are making connections to new learning.
So next we're going to go a little deeper into executive function because this area is really impacted by stress. And so like Mary said, this is like the CEO of the brain. This is how we sustain attention, reflect on the past, impulse control. And so it really refers to the set of skills we use to learn, work, and manage daily life. All of these things live in our prefrontal cortex. So during that switching station, we want during learning times for that information to go to the prefrontal cortex. And they're essential skills for successful studying and learning. So one thing that we need to definitely keep in our minds when working with our children is that their prefrontal cortex is not fully developed until their mid-20s. So don't even think about stress, but just their prefrontal cortex when they are learning, working, playing is not fully developed. And just keep that in your mind when you're working with them at home and when they're at school and just anytime. So this explains why so much of our work as parents is teaching kids how to make a plan, set goals, how to regulate their response to emotions. And we spend a lot of time teaching kids to organize their schoolwork and how to delay gratification. So of course, when it comes to learning, our goal is students to be engaged in learning. We all need to be in our prefrontal cortex to be engaged in thinking and learning. And so when we're in our prefrontal cortex, we have more access to the 9 functions you see here on the side. We're better able to access our executive functioning skills. We can think about our thinking. We can plan, learn, and respond adaptively to situations. So for our children, we may need to sometimes give them some external structures to help them to make use of some of the structures and functions of their prefrontal cortex. And that's because it's not fully developed, and that's because they experience stress and many other reasons. So when we experience stress ourselves, we kind of naturally use external structures as adults to help us engage in thinking and learning. And we support our executive functioning kind of naturally because we're older and we have experience in it, and it's just a function of our brain. It's how our brains work. So for example, have you ever had so many things to think about, too many things you need to do, that you can't even get started on one of them because your brain is just overloaded? And so it's really making it so your executive functioning skills are going to decrease. So often as adults, what we do is we make ourselves a checklist. And once we have the checklist, our brain can stop this like constant perseverating over all of these things we're thinking about. And now we can get started and working on it, right? So there's things we can do just like a checklist, including a checklist to support our children in these areas as well. And we'll talk about that more a little bit later in this session. And something to really keep in mind is that we all have different capacities to what becomes too much and what we can handle without those external structures. I think Mary can probably have like 8 things in her mind that she needs to do before she needs to write a checklist, and compared to me, like I just need a checklist in my life all of the time, or I really just can't function. But then when we're stressed, we need that even more. So maybe 8, that's a lot, but maybe 8 is Mary's capacity. And if she's feeling stressed, it's probably going to decrease a lot, and she's going to feel that need for that structure before she gets to 8. And so this capacity really changes when we're under stress. And we really need to understand what stress does to our brains so that we can understand what kind of supports our kids might need.
So we're going to talk about a specific stress response called amygdala hijack. It's also sometimes referred to as flipping your lid. That might be a term that you've kind of heard around. And remember, the amygdala are those almond-shaped structures in our brain that act as switching stations. And so amygdala hijack will happen when when our brain perceives a threat, and then we have to determine a response to that threat. And so the amygdala determines if the threat is life-threatening, then it's going to create this fight, flight, or freeze response in our bodies. Or we might determine that, oh, it startled me, but I'm actually okay, and I can use my prefrontal cortex to solve this problem or address the challenge. And so I'm just going to use a different model than the computer model, and I'm going to show you what's called the hand model of the brain. And so if we think about this hand, my hand as representing the brainstem, the cerebellum and the brainstem would be sort of my wrist and my arm, the limbic system, which is what houses the amygdala, and the hippocampus, that's my thumb, that kind of folds in, that's the middle of the brain, and then my prefrontal cortex kind of folds over top of that. So if we think about my fist, my hand, as the brain, the amygdala and the limbic system is in connection with my prefrontal cortex. I can make sense of sensory input. I can make sense of experiences that I'm having with the support of my rational thinking brain. Now, when the amygdala perceives a threat, what happens is my brain kind of goes like, ah, right? And so this is where that idea of flipping your lid kind of comes from. So I perceive a threat and my brain goes, ah, what do I need to do? And that's when, for example, if I'm walking in the neighborhood and I'm feeling pretty good and I'm going for a walk, and then I hear a dog barking kind of, from the side, my peripheral vision, my brain might go, ah, am I in danger? What's happening? And it takes me a second to look around and figure out, oh, that dog is actually inside of a fence. Or, oh, that dog is like running after me. I got to get out of here, right? If I am in danger, I don't want my brain to take time to be like, oh, what direction is he coming from? Is it a big dog or a small dog? Does it look friendly? I don't want my brain to ask all those questions. I want all the adrenaline and all of the cortisol that my body needs in order to get me out of that situation. And so this structure, this anatomy and physiology of our brain developed in order to keep us safe, right? And so when we might see this happening with little ones is perhaps you've taken your child to the doctor and had a conversation about, today you're going to get an immunization. Oh no, mom. Oh no, dad. That's not right. So we end up with a little amygdala hijack. And when that happens, it very often, you probably have had some experience similar to this. It can take a few minutes, 10, 20 minutes to come back down, for that cortisol, for that adrenaline to kind of settle down, and for us to gain access again up to our prefrontal cortex. So this happens when we perceive life-threatening danger, but this can also happen sometimes for smaller things, right? For things like if, let's say, your child expected a friend to come over and something happened and then the friend wasn't able to come over, your child might experience amygdala hijack. Or perhaps they were expecting to have dinner, or that we were going to go to the movies and then we couldn't. Maybe a change in mealtime or bedtime might cause amygdala hijack. So oftentimes we talk about this as big, unexpected responses to things that, wow, should that really have caused that big of a response? Some things that cause amygdala hijack in adults. Sometimes going to the dentist is very stressful, right, for adults. And that might feel like I need time to sort of settle my brain down. Public speaking is a really common cause of amygdala hijack in adults as well. So everybody experiences amygdala hijack. It's a normal and typical function of our brain. And it's something that you might be seeing happening more and more in your children at home. In addition to amygdala hijack, I want to also talk about chronic stress. And so flipping your lid or amygdala hijack is a description of a stress response in our brains. At the same time, this amygdala is sensing or interpreting threat. What happens is we feel this rush of adrenaline through our body. Our adrenal glands release adrenaline, release cortisol into our bloodstream. That's in order to make our muscles ready to fight, flight, or freeze, and to increase, our energy load so that we can do what we need to do to keep ourselves safe. What we're recognizing now, and what I want to kind of bring to the forefront for all of us, is that the typical process for this stress response is the release of cortisol, is that sort of heart rate increase, blood pressure increase, right? My muscles are ready. And typically, when the threat dissipates, so does the level of cortisol in my body, right? So after 10 minutes, I can take some deep breaths and I can feel more like myself again. But with a situation like COVID, where we're sort of living in this constant state of stress, right? Our bodies, our brains are not experiencing that dissipation or that decrease in cortisol. So what's happening with COVID-19 is we end up being in this sort of state of hypervigilance, right? We are always on the lookout. We're looking for the danger. Where do I need to wear a mask? Is that person wearing a mask? Is it okay for me to touch this, shopping cart? All those kinds of things. Just mentioning, Tabitha, we can click for the next part of the slide. And so these constant high levels of cortisol that are not dissipating, what happens there is it leads to less stress tolerance. So we might be noticing in ourselves, in our partners, in our children, that we are having less ability to let things roll off our back, or to just like handle things that come up in our everyday life. So we might be seeing ourselves or others have challenging behaviors in response to less threatening stimuli, right? And so the important point here is that is a result of, it could be a result of chronic stress, and just this lack of time, lack of ability for that cortisol level to decrease in our bodies. So far we've talked about the physiology of the brain, we've talked about amygdala hijack, we've talked about chronic stress, a little bit of executive functioning, and what are the ways that our brain can help us learn. We want to take a second here to give space for questions.